This video is going to deal with Dad's working career on the New York Central Railroad as a telegraph operator from 1910 until roughly 1957 when he retired. The telegraph instrument in the Morse code used on the railroads for communication along the tracks and controlling the trains was invented by Samuel F. Morse back in the 1830s. It consists of a system of dots and dashes that can be sent by a single wire over long distances and even wireless using radio signals. It gradually developed into the system that's known today. My dad learned to be a telegraph operator during a long apprentice program where he was able to learn on his own without any formal training. The length of the clicking of the telegraph key indicated the combination of dots and dashes that made each letter and number. That system was the iPhone of the 20th century and late 19th when it became prevalent in use over all types of communication, railroads and ship between newspapers, and became a general tool for communicating quickly and over long distances. The fad was such that my dad and his brothers and Alfred and his brothers connected their houses together with a wire. And I discovered this wire one time when I was in the woods between the two houses, and they were about a mile apart. I believe I was hunting squirrels, which meant that I'd be looking up into the trees and watching for them. And I noticed some wires draped through the tops of the trees. So I asked my dad if he knew about those wires, and then he told me about it, and we found a photograph of the pole leading out of Grandpa's house toward Alfred's house. So I have a key setup that was used back in those days. I have a picture here too of Dad sitting at his desk in his office working the key. During those early years, as the railroad continued to construct and expand and hire more and more people, so he began to get periodic days or a week here and there at various places. And the first assignments were 3 different telegraph offices. And in 1910, he began to work regularly at various offices so that he was getting a full month's pay every month. But in the 10 years from 1901 to 1911, his earnings were about $399. So he wasn't averaging very much in annual salary. In 1912, and I don't know how a young guy with such short service was selected, but he was offered an opportunity to work in Canada for a period of time, and he accepted it. And the first place that he worked in Canada was at St. Timothy, which I think is near Montreal. He worked there a few months, and then he was transferred to Beauharnois, which I know is a suburb of Montreal, and he worked there for another 6 months or so. And during this time, he apparently met a girl there. Her name was Juliette Belair. And I know this because after his return to Pennsylvania, she wrote him 2 letters. They're in French, and I've only looked at the salutation, which is "Mon cher Guy," which means "my dear Guy." Guy was my father's name. I had never translated these. I don't know, there's just something about probing into it. And the letters certainly weren't obscene or pornographic. That would never have been a thought in those days. But it's a very personal thing, and so I still have the letters, and the contents remain unknown to me. But apparently that didn't work out because he never went back there to visit her or anything. But in this series of entries, he records a week or two's vacation about once a year at various places. I see where he made a vacation to New Jersey, where he was stationed during the war. I don't know why he made 2 visits there a year apart, but that relationship ended there, and I have a picture of his girlfriend there, and you'll see it here. Then he visited Arkansas too for a month, and he was stationed in Arkansas at the end of his career in the Army, and so apparently he had a friend there, but he only ever made one trip there too. When Dad retired, every month was used as a basis for the amount of pension he received, and there was a controversy about his time in Canada, but the railroad still had a record of it, and they confirmed that he actually did. His service date was previous to his time in Canada, and they had maintained it throughout the 44 years or so that he'd been an employee. So he was given credit for the time that he spent in Canada. And in 1914, apparently a pretty frugal guy, because he bought the first Model T Ford in the area there. A Model T runabout in 1914 cost $440. It's worth about $30,000 now if you find one. This picture shows Dad driving his new flivver with his parents in the back seat and his sister Helen in the front seat. I have the license plates from the first 2 years of that car. They were porcelain coated and durable for life. When I was a kid, those at home, those license plates were nailed on the garage door, and one day I discovered that if I threw a stone at them, I could hear the porcelain popping off of the license plate. And fortunately, Dad came home just about that time and stopped me, but I still had damaged a couple of them. After telephones became prevalent, the Morse code gradually died out, but it was still used even with the telephone. My visits with Dad to his office, it was obvious that the telegraph key was a very busy instrument. Dad had to pay attention to make sure that he caught his address code and responded promptly when it clicked. This picture shows the method of communicating with the trains. The engineers received messages from the telegraph operator, who in turn received messages via the telegraph system from the central dispatcher in Jersey Shore. As the telegraph key clattered, each operator knew his signal, and he would respond when his signal was sounded by acknowledging his presence with a certain code. Then a dispatcher would using Morse code, would send the message that he wanted delivered to the engineer of the train that was due next. Dad interpreted the Morse code and wrote down on a special pad the message that the dispatcher wanted to send to the engineer. And this is a copy of one of Dad's early messages that he had translated. He attached it to a piece of bamboo that had a loop turned on the end of it, about 4 or 5 feet, so that the loop could be held up to the engineer as he passed by. The message was attached to the loop with a little spring clip. As the engine approached, sometimes doing 40 or 50 or 60 miles an hour, depending on the location and how straight the tracks were. But I recall seeing Dad standing out there along the track, and this huge engine bearing down on him at this terrific speed, it seemed, and the sparks and the cinders and other objects flying around and off of the train, steam flying off the cylinder boxes, and the engineer leaning out the window with his arm in a hooked position. Dad would hold this looped end up high enough for the engineer's arm to go through the loop, and as soon as the engineer had control of the loop, he snatched the message from the spring clip and threw the loop back, or the bamboo thing back, to Dad. Sometimes he didn't get the message off quickly enough, and the hoop would fly off onto the bank or down near the river. It was the train tracks had been carved from the side of the mountain, and the riverbank were very close. But the danger that Dad was in when he had to stand very close to the engine, and regardless of the weather, snow or rain or whatever, there was no exemption from needing to do that, and it took considerable courage to do that. First time I saw Dad do that, I was really concerned about his being struck by something, perhaps extending from the train or the engine, or just getting too close and being struck by this tremendous machine that was flying by the office. The other thing I remember, the first time or two that I went with Dad, the engine and the train loads would cause the rails to bounce up and down, and the ground would shake. And of course, the office was only a few feet away from the track. It was constructed on the side of the bank with long pillars sticking up from near the water's edge, and the whole thing would just shake and shimmy when the train went by. And I remember lying on the floor so that I wouldn't be knocked over from the vibrations. Inside this tiny office was a desk along the edge facing the rails and windows so that Dad could see, or the operator could see, the train and the tracks as everything passed, because one of his jobs was also to watch for hot boxes and other problems with the train. I have a copy of the article in the newspaper that commended Dad for spotting an issue with the hot box. The bearings of the axles of the engines in the cars were Babbitt, and it was a very good bearing material, but it had to be kept lubricated, and it was lubricated by cotton waste from the cotton mills packed in around the Babbitt, and the waste soaked with oil. But it was extremely difficult to keep all those thousands of axles filled with oil, and periodically they would miss their required oiling frequency and it would go dry, and then the Babbitt would get hot and melt and set the waste on fire, and smoke would come pouring out the axle, and that was called a hot box. And they were fairly frequent and caused disruption of the train, because the train had to stop and have that car removed from its train and so forth. So it was a rather disruptive issue, but unavoidable. Inside the office was a pot-bellied stove, as I mentioned earlier, but also were levers, long levers, heavy-duty things sticking out of the floor. And there were 3 of those, and they worked the semaphore stationed outside the office. And these semaphores were arms that raised in 3 positions, and there was a semaphore for each direction of travel on the track. If a train was due from the west, let's say, then that semaphore was controlling the eastbound traffic, and vice versa for westbound traffic. And the position of the semaphore told the engineer what the conditions of the tracks were like ahead. In other words, if the semaphore was straight up, it was a clear track, and he had no concerns about trains being ahead of him. If the semaphore was in a 45-degree angle, he had to be cautious that there was traffic ahead and to watch out for it in case it had to stop for an emergency or something.
Until about 1932, railroad rails were a real hazard. They were made out of an alloy that work hardened as the trains went over them, and when they broke, the internal stresses that were pounded into them caused them to curl up and rip through the bottom of the passenger cars, and they caused terrible destruction. They were like a large steel plow that ripped the bottom out of the car and threw the passengers into the meat grinder, and really it was a serious problem. And then in 1932, some metallurgist experimented with alloying some aluminum into the steel mixture as it was being formed, and that solved the problem. I have a couple pieces of broken rail that Dad acquired and uses as an anvil. It's really a handy shape for forming steel if you're trying to bend it or shape it. Throw that out as an interesting tidbit.
Before Pearl Harbor, Dad would periodically work on a Saturday or Sunday at a various station to fill in for a missing operator or vacation or whatever. Anyway, he was beginning to get some work. So if he was called to work on a Saturday or Sunday, I would sometimes go with him and spend the day. I remember this one day, it was in the winter, and we went to Maury, which is a station about 5 miles from home. But the office was about a mile down the track, so There was a parking place along the road for the telegraph operator to park his car, but then we had to walk on down the track to the office. So they went by, and it started to snow in the afternoon, and Dad's shift may have been a second shift that day, because when we left the office, the snow had already accumulated more than a foot, and it was totally dark. Dad had a kerosene lantern that was issued to all the offices and everybody that worked on the railroad. Some lanterns had a red globe in them for a signal, but most of them were clear. And they were windproofed, and they were a good device because there wasn't any electricity on the railroads either. The railroad offices were lit with a kerosene lamp. But anyway, we left the office with Dad leading the way with carrying the lantern. We got to the car, and it was really snowing. So Dad decided to put chains on the car before we left there. I don't think we'd have gotten out of there without chains, because immediately we had to climb a very steep hill to the top of the mountain. That was a very fun job, to crawl under the car and wrap the chain around the wheel. And it took probably 15 or 20 minutes to do it, because we had to lie in the snow and crawl under the car to get to the back side of each rear wheel and make the radial connection of the chain. Anyway, we got the chains on. We were all experienced, or Dad was experienced in doing it in those days, and of course I got experience too later on when I had a car. And, we put the chains on. We made it up the long, steep hill, probably over a mile. We made our way back home through the dirt roads, and we climbed up the long gradient to Alfred's house from Sandy Run. The car was just really unable to go any further. The snowfall, by the time we got to Alfred's house, and most of it was in low gear, a half hour or 40 minutes probably had passed, and the snow accumulation had gotten to the point where the old Plymouth was just not going to go any further. And so Dad decided to leave the car at Alfred's, and we cut through the woods about a mile to home. So Dad was leading the way with the lantern, and this woods was rather dense. I had a lot of pine and hemlock, and the branches of these trees were depressed down to the ground from the weight of the wet snow. And so nothing was familiar. Everything I had remembered from traveling that path many times. It was just a total new atmosphere there. And as I walked along and followed Dad with this really dim lantern light, I was in the darkness behind him, and it seemed threatening and ominous to see the deep shadows cast through the thick trees. It's a memory I won't forget. I wasn't actually afraid, but it seemed ominous to me. But we got home all right, and next day we went back and got the car and got home with it. Another time I went with Dad. And this time he had a few days at Carthus. Carthus had a siding in front of the office, and there was a tunnel about a mile up the tracks. But on the siding was a hand car used by the work crews that worked on the railroad. They used this hand car for inspection or maintenance work, or the men could stand around it and help pump the thing. And it worked, as you can see from this picture, by simply pumping the handles up and down, and usually two men did this because this thing was heavy, and it could zip right along. It didn't move very easily, but I was at an age then, probably 13 or some such age, where I could make it move myself under my own strength. So I asked Dad if I could take it up the track and take a ride in it. And he reluctantly agreed, but he told me not to go very far because in case the track had to be used by a train, and he didn't want me out there with that thing. So I pumped up the track. I could see the tunnel ahead, so I decided to go up through the tunnel. Thought it would be a nice experience to see what was inside, and I did that. But I was gone a lot longer than I anticipated, and by the time I got back to the office, my dad was rather deeply concerned about me, and the issue that it would have created for him, I suppose, if something unnecessary would have happened and created attention to my unauthorized use of that car. And and the responsibility he took. The railroads were not a friendly place to work. The rules were strict, and rightly so, because of the danger constantly presenting itself from all this heavy machinery and, well, just being in a business. My dad was not a big man. He was about 5'11" and a half, roughly, and he weighed about 170 pounds. He always maintained his trim configuration, and I think he kept his weight and a muscular tone in shape by working endlessly. There was always something to do, and he was always active and had a curious and good mind, and never sat around. Was not a couch potato, just the opposite, actually. And he ate moderately. So following Viginette is a result of that personality. As I mentioned earlier, Dad was a telegraph operator on the New York Central, and was part of the staff that controlled the way the trains flowed and made sure that there weren't accidents and so forth, and communicated with the trains. But the trains didn't flow one after the other. There were lapses of perhaps 3 or 4 hours between trains. And so that idle time was heavy on people that were curious and active. And so one of the things that Dad began to do in the later part of his working career, when strip mines and bulldozers and trucks, all diesel powered, began to be prominent in the area. And of course those diesel engines broke down and were in constant need of repair. That resulted in lots of miscellaneous pistons and so forth lying around the various repair garages. So Dad started to collect bulldozer pistons and make hunting knives out of them. And the aluminum from the bulldozer pistons was melted in his pot-bellied stove, and aluminum melts at about 1100 degrees, so it wasn't difficult to melt aluminum in those pot-bellied stoves that glowed red under constant firing during the winter. And the blades were made from broken hacksaw blades that the railroad repair crews used to cut off the broken sections from the rail and salvage what was still good. So there was plenty of raw material freely available. And these examples that I'm showing here now are a couple of knives that I have in my possession of the quite a few that he made and sold for $5 a piece. These railroad hacksaw blades had a row of teeth on the bottom edge where the sharp edge is on this knife. So all that had to be ground off, and he did that laboriously by a hand-turned grinder that he had taken into his office. Since the office had no electricity, that was the only method he had of removing steel. And I can't guess how many hours it would take to grind a hacksaw blade down to the shape that he's got, the tapered edge, and remove all the teeth. But it was, I know from experience, that it was a very slow, laborious process. But once he got the blade ground to the proper shape, and the tang, or the part that fits inside the handle, had to even be ground down smaller, then he'd melt the aluminum in the stove and then pour the molten aluminum into the mold and let it harden up. And of course there was a lot of finish work on the handle after it was poured. That's typical of any casting. But anyway, this is a product that he made from that effort. And this is an example of a holster that he made for a knife. In this particular case, made from the cushion covers from the 1921 Baby Grand Chevrolet that we had. Stitching was dynamite wire that was used to explode the dynamite sticks and connected from the sticks to the generator, and it was only used once, so there was a lot of that laying around. It made good stitching. There was tiny copper wire inside the plastic covering. At that station was a freight office, and people bought heavy things like a stove or linoleum or furniture or that type of thing. It was delivered by freight car, to various stations along the railroads, and then the customer would come and pick it up, and it was stored in this fairly large building until the customer picked it up. Or if there were shipments going out, the shipments would be stored there until the train came, and then the stuff would be loaded into freight cars. And so it was common to have a car dropped off at Carthus with freight. And of course, Dad was responsible for maintaining that freight business, both the paperwork and also the security of it. But anyway, the freight was unloaded by a crew of railroad employees. Dad didn't unload the freight. And when a freight car came, this crew came from somewhere. I have no idea where they were stationed normally. Maybe they rode the freight car itself. But in any case, they unloaded this roll of linoleum, and then they unloaded a heavy coal-burning kitchen stove, similar to what Mom had in her kitchen. They straddled this kitchen stove over this roll of linoleum. There wasn't enough clearance for the linoleum, and it crushed two grooves right in the center of the linoleum. And it broke the linoleum, broke the backing of it, which was rather stiff. And so purchasers wouldn't accept the linoleum in that condition, rightly so. So the process then was for the railroad to try to dispose of this damaged goods. And Dad put a bid in and bought the linoleum, and he put that in our kitchen. And it was down for a long number of years. And of course, every place where this linoleum had broken was duplicated in a repetitious pattern when you unrolled the roll of linoleum. So that linoleum had those grooves permanently embedded for so long as it laid on that kitchen floor. Of course, Mom was glad to get new linoleum because the linoleum that was on there was worn to a frazzle. He also bought a desk that had been damaged, and it wasn't seriously damaged, but it had a kink in the front molding, and the customer wouldn't accept it. So Dad must have got it for a song, because we certainly didn't need a desk. I remember the paperwork that Dad had to do in calculating the amount to charge the shipper when there was a shipper of goods. And the complication, there was a book about, as I recall, a couple inches thick with thin paper, and he had to write a waybill for every article that was shipped. And if it was, let's say it was being shipped to Atlanta, it would go through a number of railroads to get to Atlanta, that particular boxcar would. And so he had to calculate the price it would cost to ship it from one point to another on a given railroad, and the rates that railroad charged, then what it would cost to have it transferred to another railroad line, and their particular requirements and so forth until it got to the destination. And it was a complicated Mickey Mouse mess. It was difficult to do. And so, and he heard about it if he made a mistake and charged too little. Of course, probably didn't hear about it if he made a mistake and charged too much. But the shippers were also aware of how much it cost. So, but Dad had to certify on a form and calculate all this stuff. He really didn't like that kind of work, but that was part of his job. They eventually stopped that shipping of goods to that station, though, and all along that railroad. The railroad just decided it was too expensive to do it, and trucks were beginning to come in, and the stuff was being hauled by trucks rather than railroads. The railroad gradually declined as the economy changed. The mines began to fade out, and trucks, large trucks began to become more popular, and the business along that whole railroad system gradually declined. And of course, the Depression really caused it to stop, essentially, for all intents and purposes. So the railroads lost huge amounts of money during the Depression. But the war then brought them back full bore. They couldn't haul fast enough, and they had a railroad car shortage because a lot of the cars that they'd stored during the Depression had become decrepit and rusted and so forth. So there was a shortage of cars and capability during the war. And of course, all that was exacerbated by the need to haul soldiers and war equipment that was not usual freight during peacetime. But after the war, then the railroads really took a big hit and gradually declined and went bankrupt. The New York Central shares were $100 in 1929, and by 1949 they dropped down to, I think, about $3, something like that. Because when Dad died, he wanted my sister to have those shares that he had, and I think he had about $5,000 or $6,000 worth of face value shares that he had bought, and he wanted my sister's son, Ron, to have funds to go to college. He gave those shares to my sister for that purpose. When he did that, I had done some research on the railroad. I knew something about the financial condition of the railroad, and I told my sister to sell it. It was around $50 or $60 at that time, but she hung on to it, and eventually it became worthless, absolutely no value whatsoever, because when it went bankrupt, they combined it with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they called it then the Penn Central, and that went bankrupt too. And the railroads have been bankrupt basically since then. The government supported them because they were a critical factor in the economy of the country. These photos were taken by Dad of a train wreck right near his office, and I thought you might be interested in seeing them. A little side note, the photos taken during World War One and during my childhood were taken by a Kodak bellows type camera that Dad bought sometime before World War One. By the time I got to using it, the bellows were bad, so I had those replaced, and I used it for several years after we were married. Of course, after the crash of '29, very few photos were taken. It was an expensive process, and expensive relative to the income that Dad had, and so I have very few photographs taken from my first year of life, basically, to the time I began to take photographs. Dad worked steadily after Pearl Harbor until he retired in 1957, and he wouldn't have retired then, except that he was up on the woodshed roof doing some repairs, and he fell off and broke his back. Fortunately, the fracture was a hairline crack in a vertebrae, but he had to stay in bed, according to the doctor, until it healed, which took a couple of months. During that time off, he realized that retirement wasn't all that bad after all, so he took his retirement. Dad was a good artist, and these reproductions of his cartoons indicate pretty good skill. In fact, he was offered a job from a newspaper in New York City to come as a cartoonist. But Dad, I guess, had been in New York City when he was at New Jersey and apparently didn't care much for it, but he wasn't persuaded by any offers to go there. My mother was a little disappointed, I remember, and kind of growled at him for not taking an opportunity to get out of Frenchville. But she had her own personal motives, legitimate ones I might add. But I don't know that he could have made a living doing this kind of thing. Obviously some men did, but they're kind of interesting, and you notice that the pug-nosed ones are a caricature of the Irish. Apparently the Irish were not especially popular in those days. With few exceptions, he was employed steadily from 1912 until 1930, a 20-year span. But, of course, in 1917, he was required to go into the Army. This is Dad's Army registration in June 1917. A couple of months after this, he was inducted into the Army in the Quartermaster Corps. He wanted to go to France, but he was 31 years old at this time, and apparently they didn't want the old guy overseas, so he served at various places in this country in the Quartermaster Corps, in New Jersey and Fort Dix and Little Rock, Arkansas. But nevertheless, these pictures show some views that he took with his Kodak Bellows camera while he was in the service. The one, the hospital scene is the one where he is shown recuperating from the removal of his tonsils. This surgery was performed in a chair without anesthetic and the use of a wire loop which tightened around the tonsil and the thin wire then sheared through the connecting tissue. Dad told me that that was one of the most gruesome things that he had ever had to endure, because obviously there was a lot of blood and of course his throat must have been. Well, I had my tonsils out when I was 6 years old, and I recall my throat was very sore, but in an adult it must have been some time for recovery from that kind of a surgery. When he came back, the Roaring Twenties employed him full time. During the 20s, there was a couple of minor strikes that lasted for 6 weeks or 2 months, even in the second case, and the railroad laid him off without pay for those times when they didn't need him. But generally, his annual income was pretty steady at about $1,600 a year. During this time period, he built this house for a man by the name of Glenn Simcox. It's an awkward-looking house, but you give a customer what he wants, I guess. It was all built by hand. There was no electricity there to help with a power saw or any of these houses that he built had any source of external power other than a handsaw and a strong arm. His little notebook has a note here that on October 20th, 1922 to November 24th, 1922, he had typhoid fever. He told me that the fever was so high that it caused the loss of his hair. It grew back around the fringes, but he was bald from then on. And he also told me that the only thing he could eat when he finally began to recuperate, and they didn't expect him to survive it, apparently, that's what he said, and the only thing he could eat was Jell-O, and apparently the typhoid and the fever affected his intestines. Typhoid does give you a terrible diarrhea. He had a short working 1926. On February 4th, 1926 to March 4th, 1926, he went to Louisiana and Arkansas, Little Rock, for a whole month. Then in September 1926 until November 11th, 1926, he spent in Orlando helping Uncle Lawrence build a house on property that he had bought. And that's such an interesting story, and I'll include that in a later video. I think you'll enjoy that Driftwood, Pennsylvania to Orlando, Florida move by my Uncle Lawrence in November of 1926. I'll hold that out as a big carrot for you to watch. The next note of interest is that he took from October 20th to November 25th, 1925 to rebuild the house that exists there now, to replace the one that burned. Of course, he didn't replace the one that burned with the same architecture, but anyway, he built a house there that Grandpa could live in, and my dad took that month off, 23 days of work, to build a house that exists there today and the one that I was raised in. So then, of course, it's not in the book, but he met my mother, and They conceived me, and I was born in April 1929. 1929 is a very significant year in the history of our country and the world, because in October of that year, just 6 months after I was born, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression of the decade of 1930 began, and by the end of that year, his steady work had ended. After the crash, Black Tuesday, October 25th, 1929, businesses really slowed down. My dad had over 20 years service on the railroad, but the layoffs had begun almost immediately, and the younger fellows had lost out right away. But since Dad had some service, he struggled on for just about a year more with increasingly intermittent days of work. And by December 31st, 1931, he was out of work completely for the next 8 years. Work began again intermittently in the late 30s, and he'd get a day or two of work periodically, but until Pearl Harbor and the real crisis of World War II impacted our country, he didn't have a regular job. I've not mentioned to any detail the two major events during this decade. The first, of course, was complications and ramifications of the crash in more detail, and also the 2 years that he spent in the CC camps in 1935 and 36. And I'll talk about those later in separate videos because they require too much time to include in this one. So we'll stop this one here now and go to the next video.